Okay, here's a solution to your issue about indirect emission onto set geometry. It's traditionally a pretty tricky thing for renderers to solve, and there's usually a couple of ways around it if the renderer can't handle it. So I've got here a pretty high-res explosion. There's a decent amount of detail in here, and this would be something that would go straight into Karma, and we'd be rendering this, and okay, there's some set geometry, and we're going to emit around to it. We're going to have that classic issue that you were referring to. So if we sort of, I've got the solution, but let's just step through it as if we don't have one for now. So we've got our volume in here, and fire up Karma, and what we're going to get, hopefully in a couple of seconds, is that classic, okay, cool, here's your pyro volume, and if you were to, do something like increase the intensity of it, because it increases the indirect emission, the CE property, it does increase what's happening on there, but a couple of other things happen. One, obviously it affects the look of the shading because that energy is going all the way through the volume as well as emitting indirectly, so it kind of destroys what you're trying to do. Short of building a custom shader that breaks these components apart, it's very tricky to solve in shading. So we take that back to where we were. And also, as you can see, indirect emission noise is usually pretty atrocious. My samples aren't high at the moment, but it can get, awful to try and solve. And a lot of the times it doesn't even converge. So we need a solution to this. So if we, let me get out of that. If we jump back into SOPs, I'm going to show you two methods that I use quite a lot to solve this. So first things first, we sort of blast everything that's not density. Density tends to exist everywhere where there's temperature. So density is a good one to use as your base. Resample it down because you don't need the same fidelity to do this kind of stuff. One approach is converting it to an SDF, smoothing it down, converting that to polys, and then scattering a bunch of points, inside that same sort of density that we originally kept. Scatter some points, use an attribute from volume, and it's going to be transferring CE. But what is CE and where is CE coming from? So if you come down here, that's our volume. Pyro bake shader, it's great. Everybody uses it. It's pretty cool. It also has the option to bake out the emission volume. So if you dump inside here, you can see exactly what it's doing, and it essentially is taking the result of what happens in the pyro bake, which is the whole masking of the density through fire and all the rest of that. It's baking it out to a Vec3 color field that you can use in an external renderer and another renderer sort of thing, but you can also use it to just steal its values from, because you don't want to steal temperature or steal heat or flame, because that hasn't had the mixing and masking applied to it. You could, but it just means that you would have to apply the mixing and masking yourself. So I find doing the baking is the better thing to do. And you've got CE. So if we were to visualize CE here, CE, that's kind of the intensity. That's like the thing that it's actually baking. We can use an attribute from volume to steal CE, and we'll store it as CD on the points. And then we can just do an attribute transfer, because that gives us some freedom to dial it up and dial it down. One of the biggest issues you'll find is that those values that it transfer, and it's kind of the reason that indirect emission is so awful to solve for a renderer, is that compared to some lights, like say 4 or 5 lights emitting light into a scene, those lights are very easy to sample and to work out what's going on and allocate samples to converge it to a smooth result. When we have indirect emission, there's potentially tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of basically tiny little voxels that almost act like point lights, spitting wild values that could range from values of 0.1 to 0.2 up to 100 to 1000. They throw so much energy into the scene, and they throw the energy in really disparate directions, and that becomes almost impossible to solve without some crazy tricks. So doing this is might be okay, but it's probably going to invite still a bit of noise, but it's also going to invite a lot of flickering. So you want to try and make this more temporally stable, and that's where something like a attribute blur comes in. So I find that like attribute blurring this will just creates more homogeneous values, and then you can always adjust them. You can pump them up as high as you want, to just, but you'll be doing this later on anyway. This is more just a visualizer, or this can help you get something that kind of feels cool. So that's a way to create something that's fairly homogeneous, temporally stable, and isn't going to have 5 trillion different little individual values in there, like if we didn't average and blur it. And we can spit it out as a mesh with CD that we're going to do something with. The other option is to do the same thing that we did before with the transfer, but maybe it's on a limited subset of points, or we're blasting away all the points that don't have any emission, like if they're black or if they're really low value, and we just copy some spheres to it. Same thing. So you kind of have 2 approaches. You have an SDF that's kind of reshaped, turned into a mesh, got the values on it, or a bunch of spheres. I think the jury's out sometimes in renderers, depending on which one is more easier to sample. At the end of the day, it's a mesh with a bunch of normals sticking out of it, and that's where the rays of energy are going to come out in their spread anyway. So they're both pretty cool options. All right, so if we go back to this guy, let's shake the volume out of the tree for now, so that all we have is these 2 grids. So I'm stop importing the particle version first, and assigning a shader, building a shader, assigning a shader. So if we merge that in, and if we get into here and enable Karma, cool. You're going to have this guy emitting here, but what's going on? Like, where is this coming from? So if we jump into the shader, you can see that it's just a standard material surface. I'm bringing in the color attribute. That's what we stored, what we made in SOPs. A handy tip hint, sure. For default colors for shading, it's very common traditionally in studios to have an offensively bright pink color for default for when an attribute doesn't exist or isn't working, because when you're testing shaders, if this is just left to, I think, the default of black, I think it's all gray, it doesn't really tell you anything. But if you make your default, this is the default color it will spit out if it can't find what's loaded. This makes it obvious to everyone that something's wrong with the shading network, something's wrong with the attribute. So pink is a pretty handy one. So we're just bringing color in, and we're just piping it into the emission color, and that way we have control for the amount of emission that's coming into this shader, out of the shader, sorry. So here's where you can usually drive most of it. And to give Karma a bit of an easier time, you can, on the material properties, say to treat this as a light source, and that will switch the sampling of it to make it a bit nicer. It also has a handy option here to have a multiplier for diffuse. So you can bump it up that way, and also sometimes bumping up the light intensity makes the specular yucky, and sometimes that's the distracting thing. So you could go the other way. Multiply its specular output, its reaction in specular to nothing. So you could have just a completely diffuse surface. Sometimes that's really handy in comp. Other times might be the opposite. Might be glass and specular, and you want really exaggerated emission glints and things like that happening in the specular areas. So it's kind of cool that they broke it up into 2. So you've kind of got your global, I guess, your global emission intensity, which is just the multiplier here, but then you've got once it becomes a light source, you do have a little bit of control there for diffuse and specular, so that's cool. So this is noisy at the moment because I've got it on pretty average sampling, but this will be so much quicker to converge to a noise-free result than doing it with the pyro volume. And also has the added benefit of you can dial this up and down to taste depending on how much you want it to brighten up the set geometry. So that's all cool. It's all good and well. And if we, we're going to drag this volume back in a sec, but we don't want to see this. We don't want this visible in the render. So how do we, get rid of it? And how you get rid of it is with render geometry settings. If you add this in here and go to Karma, and it would be under shading. So set or create, and you would say I want it to be invisible to primary rays. Primary rays are the camera rays. So you turn that off, this now becomes something that's not visible there. And now, obviously, you might want to do some light link for it so that its intensity doesn't add to the pyro volume, because you want it to pretend that it's just emitting onto the set geometry. You don't want this also illuminating your pyro, making your pyro brighter. So that's where, linking and excluding might come in. But to be honest, a lot of the time with this stuff, it's never a good idea to render this all together anyway, because then you're completely locked. It's much more common to render the volume on its own and then render the indirect emission onto the set geometry as a separate pass. So, I will put this back in here just because, at least you can see it, but I'm just mentioning to you that if you want to render these both together, then you will have to do that little bit of housekeeping to make sure that the emission coming out of our spheres doesn't go and blow the explosion emission up, which is what it's doing at the moment. But like I said, I would probably almost never render these together, but let's just pull it back out. So that's that method, and we shake that out. We can get back to where we were. Hopefully, if Karma's not dumb enough to not refresh, maybe it is. So the other option is, if we use the mesh approach, same sort of thing. I'm literally doing exactly the same thing. It's the same material that we're assigning. So, same thing with here. Switching this out and hiding it so you don't see it. You can all do all manner of things. I think it's worth testing. You test which one of these converges a bit nicer to noise free compared to the other one. Maybe the sphere-based approach is less noisy or has more fidelity. Maybe this one is a bit better. I don't know. I never really care one way or the other. It's quite common to pass either this or pass that to lighting. But yeah, that's how you would solve it.